Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andres Calvache. I'm a procurement counselor with the Connecticut Apex Accelerator. And today we'll be understanding simplified acquisitions in government contracting. But first, let's discuss a bit of who we are at CT Apex. This Apex Accelerator is funded in part through a cooperative agreement with the Department of Defense. Matching funds are provided by Connecticut's Department of Economic and Community Development, DECD. We are hosted by Sector, which is located in Groton, and we aim to help Connecticut businesses interested in competing in the government marketplace through education, guidance, and training. Connecticut Apex provides assistance with education in regard to the complexity of government contracting, assisting with federal, state, and local government registration and certification, including socioeconomic certifications, market research with procurement histories, identifying bid opportunities, preparing bid proposals, one-on-one counseling, cybersecurity requirements and compliance, and creating government-friendly capability statements and bid matching. Connecticut Apex has 7 office locations throughout Connecticut, which include Hartford, East Hartford, Rocky Hill, New Haven, Milford, Stamford, and our headquarters in Groton, Connecticut. You can follow us at CT Apex on social media, including Facebook and LinkedIn. In addition to registering online at ctptac.org, where you can sign up for government contracting assistance. Here are some of our valued resource partners located throughout all different areas of Connecticut. All of these resource partners play an important role in assisting our clients in various stages of their contracting goals. And our agenda. Today, we'll be going over the simplified acquisition procedures. I will give an overview of what they are, why they matter, and how they came to be. This will be followed by a webinar from Amanda Swanson Gulf, covering the regulatory landscape, key concepts in simplified acquisitions, navigating the simplified acquisitions process, and best practices for success. So what are simplified acquisition procedures? Simplified acquisition procedures are government procedures that aim to reduce the administrative burden and time awarding procurements below certain dollar thresholds. They reduce administrative costs, improve opportunities for socioeconomic classes, promote efficiency, and avoid unnecessary burdens for agencies. SAP covers vast ranges of services from buying catering to buying military-grade equipment. SAP revolves around 4 key federal acquisition regulations, or the FAR. FAR Part 13, which outlines what constitutes the SAP. Part 8 outlines the importance of who they are sourcing from. Part 12 deals with rules and exceptions around acquisition of commercial products. And FAR Part 15 describes the procedures for competitive and non-competitive open market acquisitions exceeding the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, or SAT for short. The 2 main thresholds that most of our clients will have to deal with are the micro purchase threshold of $10,000 and $250 for the standard Simplified Acquisition Threshold. And now a brief breakdown of the history of SAP. Known as CIRCA, the Competition and Contract Act of 1984 started it all. Special simplified procedures were established for purchases under $25K. It also established competitive rules for procurement within government contracting. Next was the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994, referred to as FASA. This broke down SAP into the standard simplified acquisition and the micro purchase thresholds, as well as involved the FAR to have provisions for expediting, but also, and more importantly, to reserve all contracts between 2.5 and 100,000 exclusively for small businesses. This is also when the WASB was included towards the small business goals for federal procurement. The Klinger-Cohen Act of 1996, or CCA, includes the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which increases the discretions of contract officers to promote competition. It also focused government efforts on IT investments while streamlining their IT procurement. It also expanded commercial items up to $5 million. As with most things, they are bound to change, whether by new laws or bills, adding new regulations, amending the FAR, increasing the thresholds to their current state of 10,000 and 250K, of course, with exceptions. And now we will hear from Amanda Swanson-Goff on the regulatory landscape of SAP.
Let's jump into the regulatory landscape and all of the different pieces that are at play when it comes to how and when the government is empowered to use simplified acquisition procedures. As I mentioned, we're not just going to talk about FAR Part 13, which is what a lot of trainings focus on. We're also going to talk about FAR Part 8, we're going to talk about Part 12, and we're going to talk about Part 15. Now, like I said, Part 13 is the primary guidance for SAP. So this includes those tricky pricing thresholds. It's going to lay out acceptable methods for purchasing things using SAP. And then it's also going to provide some statutory requirements for when the government is allowed to leverage SAP. Part 8 is going to add to the information by telling us which sources the government must prioritize when buying goods and services. You may not know this, but there are several places the government has to stop before they can come to industry to openly compete a requirement, whether it is through SAP, it is full and open competition, it is a sole source. They have a couple places they have to get through first. Part 12 is going to touch specifically on the requirements for commercial products and services. So if the government wants to use that $5 million commercial threshold, this is where you're going to find the requirements for those commercial products and services. Everything that is laid out in Part 12 applies to commercial purchases that are made using simplified acquisition procedures. And finally, Part 15 is going to give guidance for competed acquisitions that exceed those pricing thresholds. So this information is going to round out what happens when the government can't use simplified acquisitions and how those things all interact together. A quick note on regulations and the role that they play. How they are applied and how they affect a specific procurement really depends on several things. It depends on the requirement itself. It depends on the mission of the agency. It depends on the specific contracting office and even the person. Some government folks are going to feel very comfortable using SAP, leveraging these procedures and making things happen. Others are not. So the way these regulations are applied will vary even at the person level. And it's going to depend on the advocacy behind the requirement. So is there a really strong end user need for this product or service? Is there someone higher up in the agency who's really pushing this procurement? Those things are going to play a role. It has been created to make the process more efficient. Theoretically, it's not simple. There's a lot of things at play when it comes to using SAP, leveraging SAP, and putting those powers into play to get goods and services. What I'm going to talk about here is going to be the intention of these regulations, not the practical application. I am not a lawyer. I can't get into the practical application. If you know good contracts lawyers, they are the folks who can talk about that. But what we're going to walk through today is how these regulations are intended to affect the process. Now, beginning with FAR Part 13, let's take a look at simplified acquisition procedures as they're defined in Part 13 explicitly. I've selected here a couple of subsections that are especially relevant. The Federal Register is available to anyone. So if you would like to go read these things in detail, you absolutely can do that. I'm going to focus in on the things that are the most relevant in terms of shaping how SAP is used. Number one, SAP cannot be used when you can meet the requirement one of these other ways. So the supplies purchase that falls under FAR Part 8, including the federal supplies schedule. So if this is something that you can buy on GSA's Schedule 70 ITFSS, you can't use SAP to get it. You have to take it to that schedule. You also may not use SAP if there is an existing IDIQ contract vehicle that is designed for that purpose. Adding to that, other established contracts that can meet the purpose are also going to preclude you from using these sorts of procedures. So things like definitive contracts that already exist, can it be added on as a modification? Or are there larger contract vehicles that are serving that need? NASA SOUP, Alliant 2, Oasis. You all are probably familiar with some of these bigger contracts that are constantly at play. In the event that the requirement can be met one of these ways, sorry, don't pass go, do not collect $200. You may not use SAP to get that requirement. So when can you use it? Number one, you can't be met using one of those procurement methods that you've seen above. So if you can say no, no, no to all three of those, you're on your way to using SAP. Also, we're going to get into the pricing. It doesn't exceed the simplified acquisition threshold unless otherwise permitted. This is where the pricing gets kind of tricky, and we're going to walk through that step by step. Other requirements for the use of SAP, anything that is more than $10,000 but less than $250 has to be set aside for a socioeconomic program. So it could be any of them. It could be HubZone, 8A, WASB, SWSB. You can use any of these socioeconomic programs, but if it is in that range of 10 to 250,000, you have to set it aside for one of those programs. You also may not break down a large requirement into smaller parts that will allow you to be under this pricing thresholds and use SAP in order to piecemeal those things back together to meet that larger requirement. You can't pull it apart. You have to procure it as one whole requirement. And if it doesn't meet the SAP pricing thresholds, then you have to go to open competition. Even when you're considering SAP, you have to promote competition to the greatest extent possible. Remember how we started? All of this is meant to save the government money. So if competition leads to cost savings, it is the responsibility of the contracting office to promote competition to the greatest extent that they can in order to maximize the cost savings to the government. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger there. We're going to get to pricing in a little bit when we talk about using SAP, but first I want to cover these other components of the FAR that are going to play a role, starting with FAR Part 8. You may remember this is going to govern the federal supply schedules as well. This part here is particularly important, and this is the priorities for use of mandatory government sources. These are places that the government has to stop before they can then take the requirement to industry. Number one, this seems fairly obvious, but it is laid out in statute. Does the agency already have it? Are you trying to go out and buy a bunch of printer paper when the government has a warehouse full of it that your agency can use, right? You can't go out and make that purchase. You have to use what you already have. If your agency doesn't have it, does another agency have access that they can supply to you? Again, using the things that the government has already purchased before taking that requirement elsewhere. The third is going to be Federal Prison Industries, Inc., which is also going to kind of dovetail into this procurement list that's maintained by the Committee for Purchase from people who are blind or severely disabled. These are government preferred sources where you can buy products and services before taking them to industry. Finally, you get to number 5, other wholesale supply sources. GSA in particular has a lot of wholesale supplies. DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, buys a whole lot of supplies all the time. Even just today, there were nearly 300 new requirements for parts and supplies posted by DLA in SAM. And then the Department of Veteran Affairs is also going to maintain a good amount of wholesale supplies. Theoretically, really all this does is say that the government has to go to these places before it can go to industry. Most often, you can assume that the government is considering these things on a regular basis and has only determined that there's a requirement because they don't have existing inventory or they don't have access to these things in these places. But statutorily, they are required to start here. Now, FAR Part 12, let's talk about commercial products and services. What does the FAR say about that? How does it affect SAP? This is where agency heads become important. So in the event that the government would like to pursue the purchase of a commercial good or service, whether it is done through SAP or otherwise, the agency's head must first conduct market research to determine whether or not you can use a commercial product or service. Does the offering already exist in the commercial sector, or does it need to be a custom solution delivered to the government? The agency then must acquire those products and services when it's acceptable to meet a requirement. You may not go purchase a bespoke product or service if it is already an option on the open market as a commercial good or service. Finally, agency heads have to require that contractors at both the prime and the subcontract level, so this is a flow down requirement, incorporate whenever they can commercial products and services as part of the services and solutions that they supply to the government. Again, we talk about cost savings. This is where cost savings come in. Ultimately, the costs that the contractor incurs in executing a contract are going to land in the government. So The government wants to minimize that to the greatest extent possible, and integrating commercial products and services as part of that service offering can help reduce those costs. Now, if you look one subsection further, these requirements don't apply to micro purchases. They also don't apply when you are only using a purchase card being kind of the government version of a credit card. You don't have to go through this process of determining commercial products and services feasibility if you're in that very, very small purchase threshold. Finally, let's look at 15, contracting by negotiation. This is also going to play a role in SAP. Let's talk about source selection. SAP is focused on keeping it simple, right? This subpart of 15.1 is going to focus on acquisition processes and techniques that agencies may consider using. This is not a shall requirement. This is a may. So these are options that the government has when they are considering purchasing from industry. First being the best value continuum. This is a wide range of processes that you're familiar with if you have been involved in bid and proposal efforts in industry. Trade-off. There are actual methods and sciences behind determining trade-offs when comparing offerings. There is lowest price technically acceptable, LPTA. This has been not lowered. The government is using LPTA less, or trying to, particularly when the requirement is especially sophisticated. LPTA is a great solution for something like printer paper. It's a less great solution for something like a weapons platform. So starting to pay greater attention to how LPTA is used, but that is an option even laid out within the FAR. Finally, you've got tiered evaluation, another way to compare proposals. This also includes the ability to use oral presentations. So if you've never been a part of an oral presentation, they can take various forms. There's an excellent Govology webinar on oral presentations that was conducted by my peer, Lisa. This allows agencies to get proposals either in part or in full through oral presentations. So sometimes it's the case that they will provide a written proposal to the government and then present that same proposal. Sometimes the presentation is the proposal. So the materials that you develop and present are the only thing that you are giving the government in your bid for the contract. But these things are all laid out in the FAR as ways that you can get through the source selection process to get ultimately to your vendor. Other things that Part 15 is going to lay out: pricing policy. This is very important. COs have to purchase supplies and services at fair and reasonable prices. This is also the case when using simplified acquisition procedures. You should not, as a government agent buying from industry, spend more on something than you might reasonably expect to. I'll continue with my paper example that has been woven throughout. If someone is charging you $100 for 3 reams of paper, it's going to be hard to say that you purchased that paper at a fair and reasonable price. This is also going to require obtaining certified cost and pricing data. This does not apply to acquisitions at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. We include this because it's highly illustrative of how SAP is meant to reduce the burden on government. If you are at or below the SAT, you don't have to go through the process of getting certified data. This is a really cumbersome process, both on the industry and the government side, and it can take a good amount of time. So this allows the government to bypass that process as part of the benefits of using simplified acquisitions. I've laid out the history of SAP. I've laid out the regulations behind it, all of that in very complex regulatory language. Let's talk about the key concepts in simplified acquisitions that inform how the government is using it in practical terms. You guessed it, this is where the pricing is going to come in. So key concept number 1, the simplified acquisition threshold. This is critical. These thresholds are far from straightforward. There are a lot of if, ands, or buts involved in applying simplified acquisition procedures at various pricing levels. The most recent statutorily defined simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. You may remember that from the table that laid out FAR changes. The micro purchase threshold is, as of now, still set at $10,000 as it was updated to a couple of years ago. But these are not end-all be-all pricing requirements for the use of simplified procedures. So if the requirement can only be fulfilled using commercial products and services, that number jumps up to $7.5 million. This says if you can buy a commercial solution to meet that requirement, you don't have to stick to $250,000. You can buy a much larger requirement using these simplified procedures. Or can you purchase using a blanket purchase agreement? You can also use that $7.5 million limitation. That's going to come into play here. We'll talk about methods for procuring SAP requirements and BPAs and how they fit, but they're also going to have that higher $7.5 million limitation. You may be thinking $7.5 million, that's the ceiling. It is not. What if you are using SAP for a national emergency or a humanitarian relief effort, or in the event of a terrorist attack? That ceiling jumps to $13 million. Think about this in terms of SAP's goal to increase efficiency. In the event of an emergency, a terrorist attack, the need to provide humanitarian relief, time is of the essence. SAP is meant to reduce the procurement acquisition lead time and get things into the government's hands faster. So it makes sense that it would be applied in these contexts at a higher level to facilitate that more rapid execution of the contract, but only up to $13 million. So we're still not in the multi-billion-dollar contract range when we're talking about SAP. Now, if we go one more down to contingency operations, what is a contingency operation? It's going to be something like our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, typically military operations occurring overseas. When that is the case, we jump up to 15 million. So this is going to be the ceiling, end all be all, not to exceed amount for SAP. But as we've talked about, there are a lot of contextual requirements that govern when these various thresholds come into play. The one to remember is that $250,000. That is the statutorily defined simplified acquisition threshold. So that's kind of the number that you should hold in your mind, while knowing that these other acquisition values do come into play in certain contexts. I talked about there being several ways to then get at these requirements. You have the pricing in front of you, you know where you fit on the threshold. Now, how do you get what you need using simplified acquisitions? There are several different methods. I made reference previously to the government purchase card. This is very similar to like a government charge card, or if you have a company credit card, this is going to operate the same way. These can be used buying supplies, services, and construction up to that simplified acquisition threshold. This is going to be a one-time purchase of office supplies. So I am working in the front office staff at a VA medical facility, and my printer is out of paper. I can use my purchase card to go buy more paper. I don't have to go through the full competitive process. I can just use that purchase card, use simplified acquisitions, and make that happen. Purchase orders and unpriced purchase orders are also going to be an option for the government here. Typically, these are fixed price, particularly when you're talking about purchase orders. Unpriced purchase orders, what does that mean? So this is when the government needs to procure supplies or services wherein the price is unknown at the time of procurement. How is that possible? Imagine a piece of military equipment has broken down. There's no way to know what repair is needed until it has been disassembled to a certain extent. At that time, the person can then assess, this is the repair, these are the parts, these are the man hours, this is the cost. That's the sort of context in which you're going to see an unpriced purchase order. This is also an option for using simplified acquisition procedures if you reasonably expect it to be at or below the SAT. Blanket purchase agreements, we talked about these. You may remember that ceiling is $7.5 million. This is a simplified method that allows the government to fill repetitive needs. So I know I'm going to need to order paper every quarter. So I have this blanket purchase agreement. I can put out a BPA call to say, please send me more paper. That's an override simplification of how BPAs are used, but you get the idea. Things that you know you're going to use or need over and over again. This allows you to bypass writing a whole bunch of different purchase orders. The example here being, maintenance services for an electric vehicle fleet. A lot of government agencies maintain their own fleet of vehicles, so the maintenance on those things will probably be conducted using a BPA call rather than individual one-off contracts over and over again. Impressed funds and third-party drafts, this is very uncommon. It's not used regularly, but it is statutorily allowed. Under simplified acquisition procedures, the transaction can't exceed $500 or if it's a third-party draft, it doesn't exceed $2,500. So these are very, very small transactions. I got into USA Spending and said, hey, find me something that was paid for using impress funds. It was a 1-year service contract for a money counting machine at the Department of Treasury. So these are very, very small purchases. The government is not using this authority very often, but it does exist and it is available under simplified acquisition procedures. Another very small authority that you're not going to see a lot of is going to be this SF-44 purchase order. This is for on-the-spot, over-the-counter purchases when you're away from the office. Imagine you take your team to a conference in New Orleans. You need to purchase everyone's lunch. You can do that with an SF-44 purchase order. And there's some back-end things that need to happen, but that is an option as well when the government is thinking about procedures for or methods for employing SAP. Finally, fast payment. This is an interesting one wherein the government pays for the product before having actually received it. It can't exceed $35,000. So these are small transactions, not for you and me. To me, a $35,000 purchase is a lot. For the government, it's a very small transaction. And essentially, the vendor says, hey, you ordered those medical supplies. I have given it over to the Postal Service. Here's the tracking information. It is now in the hands of the government. Please pay the invoice. This allows them to do that as well. We bring all of these up so that you can see that there are various ways that the government is going to get at simplified acquisition to try and leverage that increased efficiency to the greatest extent possible and in the way that makes the most sense for their specific situation. We talked in regulations about how these things look different depending on even the individual contracting officer. There's lots of different ways they can show up. As you can see here, even just this alone provides 6 different methods for paying for those goods and services. Let's talk about as well the use of socioeconomic small businesses. So the regulation requires anything under the SAT but above the MPT be set aside for socioeconomic small businesses. This is only the case if the contracting office determines that the rule of 2 cannot be met. What is the rule of 2, you may be wondering? The rule of 2 says that there are at least 2 qualified vendors in the market who are able to meet the requirement. In that event, they are not required to set aside for socioeconomic small businesses because there's a lot of limitations on who can meet the requirement. Despite SAP being meant to improve the opportunities for small businesses, the CO is not required to have that decision reviewed under FAR subpart 19. I'm not going to get into those requirements in the event that a CO chooses not to set something aside for a small business. Oftentimes it is subject to review based on the context under FAR subpart 19.4. In this event, it is not subject to review. So that's something to keep in mind. You'll notice here on the right from a 2022 OMB memo, publicly available data suggests that almost half of the contract dollars awarded under the SAT are not going to small businesses. So that means there are other things at play here interacting with the requirements of SAP that are allowing government officials to make those purchases in certain situations without setting that aside for a socioeconomic small business. Micro purchases, another key thing to keep in mind. Keep that number 10,000 in your brain. That's the micro purchase threshold. These are very small by government standards. We talked about pricing. Pricing is complicated. Even at the micro purchase threshold, it looks a little bit different. If it is a construction purchase, the micro purchase threshold is only $2,000. If it is a contract that is subject to service contract labor standards, it's only $2,500. Now, if it is an emergency and the contract is awarded and performed inside the continental United States and Hawaii and Alaska, that ceiling jumps to $20,000. If it is outside of the United States that contract is happening, it jumps to $35,000. Now, if we get into higher education institutions and nonprofits, that becomes the determination of the head of the agency. So there's a whole lot of ifs, ands, or buts, even at the micro purchase level, when it comes to pricing requirements for using these procedures. Now, when making a micro purchase, the government strongly prefers the use of their purchase cards. However, you will see some of these things being procured using purchase orders and BPAs. Those are also allowable, but the majority of this activity is going to happen using government charge cards. Provisions that are not required at micro purchases. We find this very interesting. There's several. The first being the unenforceability of unauthorized obligations clause. This is a lot of legalese, prevents violations of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Things like sustainable acquisition policies are not going to be at play under the micro purchase threshold. Energy, water efficiency, and renewable energy, also not going to be at play under the MPT. The use of recovered materials and bio-based products, those requirements are not in play here. Contracting for environmentally preferable products and services, also not at play here. And finally, the contract does not have to specify how the payment will be made. This is unusual if you have held a standard definitive contract that is typically laid out in the requirement or in the final contract as a clause, not required here. Federal buyers also don't have to solicit quotes if they think that the price is reasonable when using the micro purchase threshold. The cost to verify reasonableness in a systematic way would really, in most cases, offset or even exceed the potential savings of using this micro purchase authority. So statutorily, they are not required to do so. Now, who's empowered to make micro purchases? Agency heads will typically delegate this authority to employees of the agency, specific employees. Members of the Air Force can also use this authority if they are those who will be using supplies and services. They are not required to have the same certificate of appointment that other contracting officers are, but they do have the authority in writing. So there is a system in which the government is establishing who may use micro purchase authorities to buy on behalf of the government and who is not empowered to do so. Now, we've talked about what this looks like in pricing. We've talked about the other FAR regulations at play. We've talked about when and how the government may use simplified acquisition procedures. Let's talk about what the process looks like. So what you see here on the right is a 2008 graphic that was developed to lay out the workflow for simplified acquisitions. This is extremely complicated, as it should be based on what you've seen in the regulations. This really has not changed despite this being an old graphic. The process from developing to awarding that requirement will look something like this in this flowchart. But again, it's going to depend greatly on 1, what is being acquired, 2, how urgent the requirement is, 3, what level of capacity the contracting office has, and 4, the relationship with the federal buyer. If you have a good relationship with your buyer, this process might be a little more expeditious than it is if you are an unknown entity to the federal buyer. What are the highlights of this process? There are a lot of things happening all at once. The workflow can look really different from one agency to another. If you've been involved in SAP before, the average processing time is 30 to 60 days. This may seem slow when thinking about urgent requirements. This is significantly faster than most traditional contracts. Additional time may be added on if there is a statement of work that's required, particularly in the event of a services procurement. But that 30 to 60 days is a pretty good rule of thumb to keep in mind. When using the federal purchase card, purchases at or below that MPT are exempt from verification in SAM. If a contractor has a delinquent debt that is subject to collection, it precludes them from being awarded government contracts. The government is not required to verify that prior to making a purchase using a government charge card at the MPT. Federal agencies are also not able to impose the following on anything that is at or below the SAT. Some of these, if you've been in this industry a long time, you'll be surprised to see are not there. Examination of books and records, auditing, certification that the contractor is not in violation of arms control treaties. We found this to be a little bit alarming. It's unlikely that contractors who are involved in arms production are also doing a lot of work at the simplified acquisition threshold. But if you think again about that maximum ceiling of $15 million, it's not out of the question. Drug-free workplace is not a requirement under SAT. Limiting the use of appropriated funds for contracts with entities not meeting veterans employment reporting requirements. This is more regulatory language. Companies have various requirements for reporting on veteran employment. That does not apply here. Contract work hours and safety standards, inclusive of overtime compensation, is not a clause that you will see here. And finally, you will not see anything about the estimated percentage of recovered material content for EPA designated items. This is going to be more and more important because you're seeing some of those clauses crop up more and more often. Other things that you should know about in this process, even with the variation that happens. Federal buyers are encouraged to use SAM, but are not required to solicit simplified acquisitions through that platform. So what does this mean for industry? Keep your SAM profile up to date. The government can log into SAM, search on various criteria, and directly solicit quotes or offers from 3 local companies and make their award from there. It is imperative to have that information up to date so that they can find you in the event that the requirement is not publicly posted. SAP also allows the federal buyer to just choose the contract winner. So rather than having a team of people that reviews the offers for a simplified acquisition, that one person is empowered to do so. If telecommuting is not prohibited as part of the requirement, the federal buyer may not ding you or your offer because you include telecommuting. This is particularly interesting considering the ongoing conversation around telecommuting, both for federal employees and in the private sector. However, the government may not score your offer lower simply because you've included telecommuting as an option, whether the agency has telecommuting allowances or not for their own employees. Evaluation of other factors. That's also going to be based really heavily on the federal buyer's knowledge of and previous experience with the supplier service. This is where things can vary really widely. Contract officers have really wide degrees of experience. Some are very new. Some may be very well versed in the specifics of the Department of Defense, but now find themselves at Veterans Affairs, where things look a little bit different. This is one of those things that's going to impact how that workflow looks dependent on the requirement and the contracting offices. So, provide an example here. Suppliers who have past performance at providing office supplies. I'm just going to stick with my printer paper example. If they've been providing office supplies, they've got good past performance for that. They are shown to be dependable. Their prices are lower. They provided numerous purchases at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. Federal buyers should be looking very closely at that vendor as someone who can meet that requirement. After doing a lot of digging, and I mean a lot of digging, we located some sample templates that federal buyers have to use when using these sorts of requirements. This is a very hands-on example of how this workflow might look different dependent on the buyer. These examples in particular are from the Department of Navy and the 2018 edition of their Simplified Acquisition Procedures Guide. Like we said, this is not the way of the road for every agency. So this is specific to the Department of Navy. The guidelines and templates may look very different agency to agency. However, we include this because we think it is a good example of the sort of basic questions and information that are required of the government when undergoing a purchase using simplified acquisition procedures. Just like with that graphic, although these are dated, nearly 6 years now, these are probably relatively unchanged with similar versions, if not these exact versions, being used currently. Now, this right here is a template of the memorandum for market research. You'll see on the leftmost panel information about how the government is estimating the cost, what NAICS code they're using, and what product service code they're using. I will talk about that in strategies for industry at the end of this presentation. It's going to get into some background, the need, who was involved in the process, what they did to conduct that market research. You're going to see a checklist over here of things that they did as part of the market research. So these are various methods of conducting that. How many folks they reached out to? Did they reach out to one vendor? Did they reach out to 5? Who are the final list of suppliers? They'll provide that information. And then it's going to get into things like pricing, ranges of prices, description of how they went about analyzing that, things that are going to be standard for payment, freight and delivery, things that they expect to see really regardless of the vendor that they select. Then they're going to, of course, provide the recommendations and conclusions based on that. Added memorandums, you're going to see a whole lot of different FAR requirements in here. Is it a brand name item? Is there unusual and compelling urgency? If there's unusual and compelling urgency, this can impact the pricing threshold. What are the licensing issues? Are there restrictive rights, proprietary information? They have to provide all of that information as well. Then you get into required sources. Like I said, you got to go to these required sources before you can go to industry. Have they taken a look at all of those places? Is there an exception that allows them to not do that? Can they get it on the federal supply schedules? Is it not on the federal supply schedules? If it's not on the federal supply schedules, green light, you may pursue simplified acquisition. If it is, you need to turn around and go back to that schedule. You're going to get into sole sourcing. Did you provide your market research information? Is it equipment that exceeds the micro purchase threshold? Is it a commercial item? We talked about the FAR. Commercial items have different requirements than non-commercial items. Does it need to be a set aside? In this case, they have it written $10,000 to $150,000. Does it have to be set aside based on that requirement in the DFARS? Is it a commercial off-the-shelf item? This goes on and on. There's a ton of information that the government has to provide to say that they have done their due diligence to determine that the requirement does meet the pricing thresholds and does meet all of the green light criteria for use of simplified acquisitions procedures. Buy American, fair and reasonable price, posting and synopsis, who is the contracting officer or representative, what have they found in SAM, what is their responsibility determination, otherwise known as past performance? Is there any other reporting requirements, particularly under the DFARS, which is going to add its own requirements on top of the regular procedures? They're putting in a ton of information here and then signing off on it to say, we have taken all of these steps, we have walked through the process, we have verified this information, we are within the statutory requirements, we're intending to go ahead with this simplified acquisition with all this information in mind. Award documentation. This is a slightly different piece of information that will then impact the data that I have access to in places like FPDS. So what is the contract number? What are the dates associated with it? What's the contract type? Was it a set aside? How many firms were solicited and how many quotes did they receive? This can be really illuminating information when analyzing an agency's buying behavior. Do they oftentimes post requirements that only have one quote received? What acquisition strategy did they use? How did they do their review of quotes? What past performance was considered? You'll get into the price analysis. Which FAR Part 13 subpart did they use in that price analysis? What is the past performance determination? Are they registered in SAM? Do they have good past performance and good records in SAM? Are they applying this contract pursuant to FAR Part 4? There's a whole lot of regulatory information that they're providing here. Things like a post-award synopsis, announcement of the contract award. So did the Navy Chief of Information get an announcement, or was he not required to? Was it posted? Was it not? Is it subject to this law? Is it not? How is it being administered? How's the COR involved? What is the PALT? Did they have to adjust it because there was an issue with a protest or technical change? How is that impacting the total award time? More signatures, taking ownership. COs are really empowered to go through this process. This is just an example of what it looks like. But as you can see, there's a lot of information and a lot of steps that they're having to take to verify that this is statutorily allowable under the requirements, not only of FAR Part 13, but of other sections of the FAR, of added regulations that are in the DFARS, the defense supplement to the FAR. They have a lot of due diligence that has to happen in order to use SAP. You might be looking at these documents thinking that does not reduce the burden at all. There's a whole lot of documentation here. There's a whole lot of checkboxes. This is much simpler than conducting a fully competed procurement. There's a lot of paperwork here to verify the applicability, verify compliance with the statute, but this is going to be a less burdensome process than doing the same thing, but in an openly competed environment. Let's talk, we're going to close in practices for success. What do you do with all this information, particularly from the industry side, to leverage it and make the most of SAP opportunities for your business? Number one, if you are government, use SAP as part of your agency's small business strategy. If you are industry, note the finer points of your target agency's small business strategy. This is going to provide an easier solution to meet those requirements. It'll save time, and these procurements contribute to small business achievements. So it's important to know how SAP fits into your target buyer's strategy. And on the government side, don't be afraid to leverage SAP as part of that strategy. You need to know the rules of the road. So as we've talked about, this looks different in every agency across the government. It's very complex. Folks are going to have their own procedures. They're going to have their own requirements. Folks that have a supplement like the DFARS may have additional requirements. You need to know the rules of the road that are specific to your target customer. If you're on the government side, you need to know what this looks like in your agency. I've provided a very generic overview of what everyone must do in order to use SAP, but it's going to look differently in practical terms across the government. For industry, don't be afraid to educate your clients on how they can use SAP to meet their needs. Obligations year over year are growing at a pretty steady rate. The number of 1102 contracting officers across the government is declining. These folks are so busy. They are responsible for more dollars per contract officer than ever before. They may not know that SAP is allowable and can make their lives a lot easier. So if you have those relationships, you have those conversations, don't be afraid to provide them with the solution that says, hey, you have this requirement, I can fulfill it. We meet the pricing threshold. This can be a lot easier than it would be if you take it for competition. Don't wait for the Q4 sprint. If you've been around this industry, you're familiar with the sprint that happens in July, August, and September. This is getting worse as funding continues to arrive at agencies later and later in the fiscal year. Don't wait for Q4. There's going to be a ton of activity in Q4, so you want to be ready for it. Build your strategy. Include time-saving procedures if you're on the government side, like SAP, as part of your plan to cope with the influx of activity that's going to happen at the end of the fiscal year. If you're an industry, price your products and services strategically. If you can reasonably meet a customer's needs within those pricing limitations that we talked about under simplified acquisition procedures, it's a huge advantage. So price it that way and market it that way so that they know right off the bat that this is a requirement that can be procured under those simplified acquisition procedures. Know your product service codes, your PSCs. Industry often speaks in NAICS codes. A lot of times we refer to our NAICS codes. The government tends to think more in terms of PSC codes. So you need to know where your offerings fall in the PSC code dictionary as well so that you're not missing relevant things. And you want to make sure those PSC codes are in your SAM profile. Identify the right federal buyers. Not every federal buyer is going to use SAP. Some agencies just don't have requirements small enough to use SAP. They may not have a desire to use SAP. Whatever the motivation may be, it's not going to be every buyer. Although the data are complex, you can search data to find federal buyers that are experienced using SAP. So if you log into somewhere like USA Spending and just do a simple keyword search on simplified acquisition, it has to be in the FPDS description. It'll pull up that information for you, and you can start to identify some of those who some of those folks are and eliminate others who are not.
Well, that was a lot of information. And again, just to recap a bit of some of the best practices for success, as mentioned by Amanda. She listed a bunch of them, but I think one of the strongest ones that you can do is contact your CT Apex counselor. As you can see, a lot of the work there is very convoluted and complex, and this is the easy route. So we really strongly recommend that you reach out to your Apex counselor and make sure you schedule some time to discuss any of these type of relevant points if they interest you, or if you feel that it could benefit your company or business. And at this moment, I'd like to ask the attendees a couple of quick questions to gauge their acquired knowledge of SAP. It's quiz time. So, first one. Which section of the FAR deals explicitly with simplified acquisition procedures? What is the micro purchase threshold? Under no circumstances may simplified acquisition procedures be used for procurement exceeding 7.5 million. Which is not an approved method for procuring products and services using SAP. Any procurement of more than 10,000 but less than 250,000 must be set aside for a small business program. Okay, and the quiz answers. So, which section of the FAR deals explicitly with SAP? FAR Part 13. What is the micro purchase threshold? 10,000. Under no circumstances may SAP use for procurement exceeding 7.5 million. That's false. You can reach even up to 15. Which is not an approved method for procuring products and services using SAP? Task order. And any procurement of more than 10,000 but less than 250,000 must be set aside for a small business program. True. And at this moment, we'd like to ask the audience for any questions they may have regarding SAP. I already see a couple of questions in the queue. Okay, let me answer the first one that's there. Are there any required sources for supplies or services under SAP? Yes, there are required sources in the SAP. As outlined in FAR Part 8, there are mandatory government sources that must first be reviewed and checked on before going to any outside sources. Can I use SAP for construction? Yes, construction is purchasable through SAP, depending on the threshold and method, such as P card, which is limited to 2K, but again, there are always exceptions for those type of things, and other factors, whether or not this is an emergency or an expedited timeline, the dollar value may be exceeded above the SAT, which is the simplified acquisition threshold. Will these slides be sent out or made available? Yes, the recording and slides will be made available after the presentation has concluded. Are there any trainings, resources available for learning more about SAP? Yes, there are resources available for learning more about SAP. There are resources that we host here, such as these training events, and there are other training catalogs available online, as well as other free online resources. And there are other different partners that we can have, various trainings or other events available. Can SAP be used for small technology purchases or small consultant services? Yes, SAP can be used for small technology purchases or small consultant services. Again, this also depends upon the solicitor or the contracting officer making the purchase, as well as the limitations based on whether or not there is already an existing source available within the government. So if there isn't an IDIQ, an indefinite agreement to purchase sources for those technologies, or whether or not there's a blanket purchase agreement already present that already cover or at least are associated with those services. Are there any other questions available? So is government spending the best to search for SAP? I believe you mean usaspending.gov. USAspending.gov would be, yes, USAspending.gov would be the best source to look for whether or not something is being purchased through SAP. However, a lot of the information that is located on there isn't quite up to snuff with giving the best picture of all the ultimate purchases that are done under SAP. You'd be shocked to see the actual amount of purchasing that occurs under SAP that isn't actually listed because it might just be excluded from that type of listing, or just didn't meet a specific threshold, or just because it was done through some type of other alternative method. One of the best things that we can offer is to reach out, as listed by, as stated by Rob, by Ms. Goff, that you have to reach out to their contracting officers, look on USA Spending to see which agencies are buying those services under SAP, and look for those contracting officers information to contact them, introduce yourself, make sure you're acquainted with their timelines, make sure you're acquainted with the services that they need and how you can best specifically meet those needs. Hopefully that answered your question, Rob. Okay. And with that, are there any other questions? And with that, thank you again for joining us today. If you have any further questions, or if you're one of my clients and would like to set up some time to learn a bit more about how we can approach SAP for your business, please contact me at the email listed here. And thank you for attending our webinar. Please visit our calendar page for our upcoming training and events. Also, stay up to date with government contracting by reading our newsletter. Have a great day.